Hi again. In this session, we'll continue our discussion on design issues. As I said, design is very important and it reflects many of the hotly debated issues. So we'll continue to use our common sense approach, but also guided with evidence based on country experiences on evidence. So now let's look at the last one, the last bit. Like the first one I introduced. The issues are related to design issues, and then the second session we focus on inclusion error because it's very, very important. And now is last thing I left it to say, we need to go to the developmental approach. We don't want to create a charity, or government is not a charity organization, so developmental approach is very important, but it's easily said, and some people would say maybe it's hardly to do, but let's look at how. What's the alternative? What if you cannot target only the poor? How you will design your program? And it's very important. Again, we want to reach out to the poor. That's for sure. We need to not to exclude anyone that who deserves a benefit or who is need. But as we discuss in the exclusion error, while doing this, you don't need to also like create other troubles of once you exclusively target the poor, then you create stigmatization, gender issues, or other issues. So let's look at the alternative. What can be done? It's very important, our approach, the developmental approach, instead of targeting poverty. Remember the example. I don't need to tell my daughter, if you fail an exam, I'll give you an award. Instead of focusing too much on the exam, or I look at the underlying sources. Like the government needs not to look at poverty to make the benefit tied to poverty, but rather to look at what causes poverty. And then you link the program in a way that does not create the disincentive to work. So let's look at what causes poverty. Let's look at this minimum standards of living, like every society, not necessarily the poverty line, but every society, they have a level of, what they consider that is decent level, or below this, it's, they consider it's not good or they not deserving. So how people fall under the poverty? Think about yourself. If you have children, myself, it's always, you have children, it's, imagine that we don't have any social security system. So there is no maternity benefit or anything. Imagine, like two breadwinners, no children. It's okay. Usually they are above the poverty line. But what happens is that once you have a child, a wife usually would, because of maternity, will step out and sometimes extended stay to take care of the need of the children if there is no support system. So that minute when it happens, they all of a sudden, they fall in poverty because of, like the one income. You used to be two income, one income, but it's also the extra costs associated with having children that usually many people not even aware of, like lots of expenses. Right, and then what happens? They stay this, and then the woman, especially the labor force, female labor force participant, she feel now maybe time to go back to work. Started, two income household. It's fine. They get a promotion. Everything is fine. Then one of the two breadwinners, maybe unemployment or sickness or unemployment. And then once you lose one source of income because of unemployment, that will get them back under the poverty threshold. Then they go back, hopefully it's not long term, and then they get a promotion. Then they decided to have another child. The same story again. They go back, and then they fall into, like end of career and retirement. Let's assume again that there is no social protection system. If there is no social protection system, then they run into poverty. Right. So we need our system to really intervene at these points. Not necessarily we talk about poverty, but we know that these groups are, vulnerable. Like the vulnerable groups that, you can use it if you don't want to create incentive that I'm giving you money because you're poor. So then you give the incentive to people to continue to be poor to benefit from the system. If you don't want to do that, then you might look at the underlying causes like this. Another group you might think of, somebody born with the long-term disability and the labor market is not inclusive of persons with disability, or maybe even they can work, but because of lack of education, maybe because of, again, like the education system is not inclusive. So if or discriminatory, or, they will end up, in long-term poverty, right? So we need our system to recognize these groups. Again, household with children under pressure, unemployment, then you would run into the situation of maternity and then old age disability. There is another group. Another group is the working poor. They might be working, but they are here, working poor. And the working poor is critical to look at it carefully. Working poor is quite difficult to handle because through cash. I usually, like my point on this one is cash transfer for the working poor in many low middle income countries can be difficult and can create the disincentive to work. I would rather for the working poor that they work but they're not producing enough money. They will be supported through children, through maternity, through old age. But if that is not enough, then it's the issue, it's the skilling. Like the skill set they have, it's not rewarded in the modern labor market. So the issue here, it becomes how to reskill. Again, reskilling is not to teach them coding or, let's be realistic. It might be just simple they work in the agriculture sector. Maybe it's just like certain seeds, certain fertilizer, train how to use certain safely fertilizers, or making them use some of the equipment rented it for free, or certain things like this, helping in marketing. Again, the reskilling element to this group. And it might be not enough. There is the minimum wage. The minimum wage, that's another instrument. But we are here discussing cash transfer. So for the working poor, I think, like the labor market interventions more or better than giving cash. Because if you give the working poor cash, they are here, they would not go up. They will say, okay, if I go up, I will lose the benefit. Let me stay here. So we need for the working poor not to be careful about it, right? So it's again the whole logic. What we are doing is to consider poverty is not something you can absorb. It's not written on somebody's face. That person is poor. Give money, not give money, because it's not observed, and because of the many issues we raised so far. It's better to look at the underlying conditions that lead to poverty, which is household with children, maternity, old age, working poor. We said we keep it for the labor market, disability. Those things. And this is exactly what you see in many countries. That's exactly what you see. And this is where we started our discussion about social protection. You see OECD countries, they recognize this situation. So what they do here is you tax the people in the working age. Remember here what we said. This is the group, is this and this especially. So you tax this here because they generate income. And here you give it positive. So you give from here to here, right? Or here. Household with children, they net recipient of government support, and our senior citizens, they are net recipient. And who pays the bill? It's the working age. It might be, like the working age support the senior citizen, or they might be, like saving, as we will discuss later on the form of financing. It might be they save for their retirement, so for themselves, or for the current through taxation that they can support. But the point is to say, like, this is the modern, thinking is you look at the life cycle. The life cycle, we recognize that working age population, they tend to participate, benefit more. If you remember the whole story of the train, that we saw that young people, the ones they are able to catch the train when we started our discussion. So this is where you can shift from the working age to non-working age population, whether to senior citizens or household with children. Right. So the point, as in one example, when you use life cycle approach, these are the programs that you can consider without creating incentive for not working. Like social pension. We talk, many people, they don't give the fish, but teach people how to fish. But senior citizens, they're not supposed to fish, or children. So you don't need, there's no incentive for them to work, but we know they are at higher risk of poverty. So when you give social pension, there's no need to create, back to work. There's no back to work. This is, it's very inclusive. It's because respecting senior citizens. And this is very important, like senior citizen in all countries, there is respect to the seniors in especially low-income countries. So nobody will come screaming, or you remember the images I said, when people don't understand a benefit, they will say, oh, I don't receive the benefit because I'm not from the maybe dominant ethnicity, or maybe not from the ruling party, or they would not say that, because it's crystal clear. You're not getting the benefit because you're not the age 70 and above. You are 35, you're not receiving, and it's crystal clear, people respect it. Or you're not receiving benefit because you're not a person with disability. You don't have disability, and it's crystal clear. Even in the middle of crisis, people will still understand it. You're not receiving benefit because this is meant for maternity. So again, people will understand it. For children, that can be a bit tricky in many low-income countries when you have a number of children very high and physical space is limited. So you might, for many low-income countries, it's the trick here is not to, to go 18 years old. It might be very, you cannot afford it, but rather to, to choose maybe the first 1,000 day, 2 years of age. And why 1,000 day? Because 1,000 day is very important. It's called like the window of, like the golden window of opportunity, where you invest, the brain is being developed. So especially malnutrition, that stunting at that age, not receiving enough nutrition, that translates into children be in less than the age of 5, shorter for than their age. And when we say stunting, shorter for than age, it's not because of ethnicity or, because we talk about children from 0 to 5. It's still, the work of genes, or, it's not working, usually not for this group. So the stunting, it's associated with lack of cognitive development in the brain. They will go to school, they will not be as attentive as children who are not malnutrition. So because of that fact, and we're focusing on developmental investment, it's investing in this 1,000 day is critical. It's very critical. So you might say, okay, we don't have the ability to cover all children. We cover 1,000 day, 2 years plus maybe minus half, which is a pregnancy, minus half year, which is pregnancy, and up to 2 years. We say we cover children. Maybe it's not affordable for all children. We start with districts with the highest stunting rate, the highest malnutrition. We say we give them priority. Once we have more resources, we increase. And this is developmental. You're not going who is poor, who is not, and then people starting, moving the child with skinny child from one place to another. So the family will be targeted because they are malnutrition, as I mentioned before. But here you're focusing, we're giving this community, all children in that community. We cannot afford it for the whole nation, but at least in certain the districts or provinces or states that have highest stunting rate, we start with them, we prioritize them. As we move on, we can give more money. For social pension, somebody would say, how that will be, well, respect to senior citizens. They contributed through all their life to the development of the nation, whether in taxation or being school teacher or being, builders, and they contribute. It's time to respect them. Time to, but it's also, we have evidence that whatever you give to the senior citizen, it will move from here to children. There is that altruistic behavior that will, they live usually together, like in many communities, or even not. So what is in how to reach the children? The money is given to the senior citizen, but doesn't stay there. It will go to children. And think of your parents, my parents, always that altruistic view, that always whatever they have, the little they give it to our children. And that's there is evidence that from South Africa, for instance, that households that they receive pension, children in those households, they receive better nutrition. Stunting rate is lower. Right? So it's very important, to keep in this in our mind. I left this open here. Didn't talk about it. Unemployment, similar to working age poverty, working but not having enough. As I said, in many low-income countries, you need to be careful about them. It's better to use the labor market interventions. It might be, but it has more discussion, more scrutiny, because you don't want to create incentive for people to not to work. So it's very important, like this working poor, to look at it in different context, right? Let's take one example. Again, we need to appeal to rationality. We need to be logical, use common sense. And now, this is what is common. This is what everyone say. This is a great example, or a great program. So this program, imagine you target based on poverty, and this is many countries, like I mentioned, like the famous cash transfers that the World Bank designed, proxy-means testing, all those statisticians design, what happens is that you have, a household that they say, okay, we have a threshold of 1,000. Anyone below this threshold, will give them money. If they are poor, we'll give them money. It sounded perfect, but we need to be careful about it. It's in social policy, it's not, just to look at it quickly, and we need to disaggregate, look at, investigate. So it sounded perfect, because they give 300. That seems clear that they give it to the household with low income. So this household will receive 300. This will not receive any money. So far, so good. But let's look at the decomposition of the household. Now we need to change our mentality. Remember, we're not a charity organization. If it's charity organization, that is good, because you give the household with lower money, that lower income, and you give them. But if we are developmental in our approach, you don't do that. This household, let's look at it. Why a household of two people, they live in poverty? Why? Let's look at the scenarios. One scenario is the wife is not working. If the wife, and this is common, like lower participation rate of female citizens. And if the woman is not working, the female labor force participant is not working, you don't solve it with money. You solve it by education, skilling, by inclusive labor market. Probably there is discriminatory practices that women are not supposed to work, cultural behavior change. But you don't solve it with cash. What happens if you solve it with cash? Imagine now they are 800 and a woman is offered to work for 500. Just imagine that. Now the family, they will not say, great, we're going to get 500, so we'll be 1,300 above the poverty level. That will not happen. What happens, they sit together and they say, oh, you're going to get 500, but guess what? You're going to lose the 300. Is it worth it to work for 200? They say, no, forget about it. Let's go with this one. This is common. And this is what I said, you don't need to create incentive structure for people not to work. A charity model that targets exclusively the poor, that the dynamics will happen. Not necessarily the woman, maybe the husband, they both working, but they working and not making enough money. Now the husband got, like an opportunity to work extra. Let's say, we talked about the wife, and let's talk about the husband. And the husband now is offered extra, like to work extra shift, will say, we'll get 400. The same logic, we'll say 400, but if I get the 400, I will lose this. Is it worth it to work extra? Not for 400 now. We'll say, is it worth it to work extra for extra 100? The discussion becomes, because I'm going to lose this one, it will be 100. And they say, forget about it. I'm not going to work. Or maybe they will not be even interested in learning new things. You say, it's good. What we're getting, 800, 300, that's good. Right? But this household is different. This household is different. Children living in conditions of poverty, they will receive bad nutrition that will, their cognitive development will affect their learning ability, and later on when they participate in the labor market, they will not be as productive. But let's move away from charity. We said we're not a charity organization. Even if it sounded right, even if it sounded okay, we give those below the poverty income. Even if it sounded right, but it's not correct. We need to look at developmental. Developmental approach, they look at this group, look at the life cycle. Is there any life cycle? They're not seniors. They don't have children. They're gonna get zero benefit. Maybe they working poor, they get skilling. But in general, labor market intervention. But cash is zero. There is no cash. This is the developmental. Even if they are poor, it's okay, because once you are under pressure at that age, it's not you are a child or senior citizens. At that age, you need to get yourself and be challenged to, and all of us, we challenge in our lives at that age, to get more opportunities. So that's learning. It's also part of it. And when if the government wanted to intervene, they intervene in skilling and labor market and minimum wage. But this developmental. But look at this household. Now remember, I said the 1,000 day, there's a program. Let's say the 1,000 day, these two kids, they are toddler less than 2 years old, and infant, they get 150. And school feeding program. This is one of, it's not always to give cash, schooling feeding program, you can consider it, equivalent of cash transfer, which is enormous evidence of its benefit. So now in developmental approach, because they say children, we need to focus on them because it's developmental. It's not because it's charity. We're not giving them because they are actually above the poverty line, but it's not we covering them because they are poor. But we're covering them because it's developmental. We need to take care of those children. So they get 150 school feeding program, right? So school feeding program, 150, maybe the family, they use it for children, they use it for other things, but they meet the pressure that the family is under, right? But the beauty about the life cycle approach, it corresponds to vulnerability. Remember, in the charity, you give 300, that's it. But in life cycle approach, the more, if you have one child, you get under 52. But imagine now this child is with disability. Disability is associated. There are extra expenses, to take care of those children, whether it's education, whether it's specific needs. So now, because it's life cycle approach, the child, because disability, will get extra money because there's a benefit, not only the school feeding program, but there's a benefit for person with disability. Person with disability will get extra. So now they move 550, right? And imagine, if their senior citizens live in the household. And poverty in many countries, it's actually, you have poverty because bigger household. And bigger household, it's not only because they have more children, it's because also 3-generation households, they live in the same household, that created pressure on the family, that created more poverty. Imagine if you have senior citizens and the government allocate resources based on, life cycle approach. So they moved from 0 to 1350. And you can see why I consider it developmental. It's based on, the understanding that, we need to look at not targeting the poor and making these people lazy not to work, as we discussed, but rather we're looking at, senior citizens getting money. We're not interested in them to work or not, because they are very senior. It's respect to the senior citizen, right? And the discussion always, wait, Amjad, we don't have money. I wanted you to remember, this might be an opinion. We need to dig deep into the fiscal space. In many countries, they waste resources on useless things. Like for instance, in Egypt, I did some work on gasoline subsidy. Gasoline subsidy for cars. 93% of the gasoline subsidy captured by the richest 20%, the ones they own cars. This is not the other petroleum subsidy that goes to factories or others. Just gasoline, the one that. And what you can do with gasoline subsidy, you can cover all children in the country up to the age 14, and you can double the budget to Minister of Education and Health with that money. So it's the decision to say we afford it or not. We need to look at it. Let's not have any assumptions before we start. And usually we'd say, we live with the government, we don't have, but sometimes you can create reallocation. But even if we cannot afford it, as I mentioned, you can't, you really need to not to start all at once. You say a vision, you need to have a vision. Sometimes it's much worse if the government does not intervene. Remember about the incentive structure that governments give money so people don't work, they don't acquire skills because they say if we work extra we will not benefit. So sometimes governments, if they don't intervene, it's better. So it's better to start slowly, but in concrete steps that are not the charity way, but developmental, better than doing a program that is useless, that create more harm than benefit. So you don't need to start all at once. You start, as I discussed, you start, maybe one benefit, maybe social pension. And why social pension? Because you think about about pension in low-income countries. In many countries, for instance, in Yemen, in all African, sub-Saharan African countries, in low-income countries, in many countries, the percentage of senior citizens about 2 to 3%. 2-3%, maximum 4% in low-income countries, in sub-Saharan African countries. So targeting, this group, it might be easy. Even if we don't have money, we say, maybe we start with certain districts that are extremely in bad situation, let's say maybe not social pension if you don't want, you can do for children less than 2 years old, the 1000 days, very important. Maybe we start with those districts and later on we expand, maybe start school feeding program because malnutrition is really, really bad and deteriorating, and this is developmental because malnutrition will cause harm to our labor force in the future. Kids will go to school not able to, so we need to prioritize it, but we cannot afford it. We start with the districts that with high level of malnutrition, and then you expand, and you might combine both of them. You might combine like 1 and 2, pension and slowly, and maybe even pension and 1000 days or senior citizen living in household with children, only the ones they receive. So you can, but the point to make is not to exclusively target who is poor and create disincentive, because once you exclusively target who is poor, then people will stop working in fear that they will get the benefit. Right? And this is for us on design issues, but there are other design issues related to gender dimension and other things. We'll move on, but for now I think it's enough. We'll look at financing later on and start getting into fiscal space.